Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Carolyn Kane, and I'm Assistant Director of Alumni Relations at DePaul University. I would like to welcome you all to the Chicago Architecture Tour, Civil War and Chicago's Role, Rosehill Cemetery. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter for this evening, Ellen Shreve.
All right, so I'd like to welcome you to Chicago's Rosehill Cemetery, and we're going to talk today about the Civil War and Chicago's role there. And actually, I'm going to take you on a little trip through the cemetery as if we were going on a tour. So walking through the gate, let me point out that this is the largest of three major non-denominational cemeteries in Chicago that were done in the pre-Civil War era. Rosehill and Graceland and Oakwoods are the three cemeteries. Rosehill was founded in 1859, and it is the largest of the three. Chicago at this time was the fourth most populated state, well, Illinois, not Chicago. It was the most populated state after New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. And during the war, the population of Chicago doubles from 100,000 to 200,000. The most important thing about Chicago in the Civil War is that, like Napoleon said, an army travels on its stomach. And Chicago was the feeder of those stomachs because we were the largest grain producer in the Union. We were the largest exporter of meat packing, pork, salt pork, and beef. And we had the first skyscrapers were the grain elevators along the lake. Chicago also provided what was the primary thing that soldiers ate during the Civil War, something called hardtack, which is a tough, thick cracker. Chicago also was the railroad center of the United States, and it could send out all this food everywhere that the Army ended up. That was the trump card for the Union, the railroad. Unfortunately, nearly 4,000 Chicagoans died in the Civil War. This is the main gate, and if it looks familiar to you with those, what we call crenellated tops, that the tops of those towers that look like they are from an English castle, that's because this is done by the same architect who did the water tower, W.W. Boyington. It's one of the first architects in Chicago. This is a Victorian romantic cemetery, meaning that a lot of the ideas about cemeteries at this time this was a wonderful place to come out for a Sunday drive and then spread out a picnic and everybody sits around.
I can't see your screen. Could you try sharing it one more time?
Oh, I am so sorry. Let me try this again. How's that work? That work now? Okay, so this again is the gate that was done by W.W. Boyington. I'm sorry about that. And this is the cemetery. If you look on the left-hand picture, you'll see the boundaries. This is up on the north side, along Western Avenue, Peterson Avenue, Ravenswood, and then that diagonal line is the connection to Bowmanville, which is the neighborhood right next to it. So many of the graves depict very typical Victorian cemetery imagery, and I'm going to talk about that when we get there. So the Civil War begins in 1861, just a little bit after they build this gate. And some soldiers were originally buried in the Lincoln Park Cemetery, but were moved up here. But nobody wanted Confederates in this cemetery. So if you want to see Confederate graves, you have to go to Oakwoods instead. The Civil War was fought on two fronts. The two yellow states to your right, West Virginia, and then around Washington, D.C., that's the Eastern Front. Most of the men who are buried in Rosehill fought on the Western Front, which was the campaign to keep Kentucky and Missouri, which are the two states on the left that are in yellow, to keep them in the Union. Once they win over Kentucky, they begin to go down the Mississippi River and take Vicksburg, which is the most important fort that they take in Mississippi. And then the Union runs to the east and right across the south. That's Sherman's drive to the sea. So as I said, men in the cemetery are mostly from the Western Front. Very few of the battles that I'm going to talk about are real famous ones like Gettysburg or Vicksburg, but there are a lot of small affairs. There were more than 10,000 military battles during the Civil War. And just to tell you, Rosehill is included in the 34 National Park Service Civil War sites, even though it's a private cemetery. The picture that you see here is how they got the coffins to the cemetery. They brought them on the railroad, which is today the Metra, and let them off and then took them down in the elevator. This is the elevator. It's not used anymore, and it's in the parking lot. So as we walk up that path that's across the top of the slide, and we're going towards the big monument that's in the middle of the slide, the big tall obelisk with the guy standing on top, you see the graves of 230 soldiers. These men were mostly guards at Camp Douglas, which was a prisoner of war camp, and a lot of them are unknown soldiers. The Civil War ran between 1861 and 66, and 22,000 men in Cook County went to war, the largest percentage of any county in the Union. Rosehill has the largest number of Civil War soldiers and veterans buried here than any other cemetery in the Midwest. And among them are 230 Union soldiers, 14 generals, 14 colonels, 4 majors, captains, lieutenants, drummer boys, buglers, chaplains, and women nurses. So what are we going to see today? We're going to see some of the heroes, the generals, and I just want to point out, Major General is higher than Brigadier General. Brigadier General is a 1-star, Major is a 2-star. We don't have any 3 or 4 stars in the cemetery. Breveted generals, I'll explain in a minute. Then we're going to talk about Camp Douglas, which was a POW camp located between 31st and 35th Street on the south side of Chicago. Then we'll talk about the U.S. colored troops. We have one big politician buried here, most of the journalists, and then look at some of the battle and regimental monuments. So here we come to Monument Circle. This is a circle of land, and right in the middle is, I was going to explain, I'm sorry, let me explain breveted brigadier generals before we go on. But a breveted general was somebody who was awarded the title of general if they were a colonel before, and they were fighting in the field and they did so well. If they ever went back to the field, they would still be a colonel. But by putting them up as a breveted general, they got more money in their pension. And that was a big honor to get that. Okay, so now we're here at the monument. This is a statue by sculptor Leonard Volk. The statue is called Our Heroes, and it is a tall column, and on the bottom, you see those bronze, those are the green symbols. There's one there for the artillery, one for the infantry, cavalry, and the Navy. The soldier is with a furled flag on his left arm. That means the war is over, and a broken sword on the right. Now, the thing you have to know the most about the artillery is that the artillery probably won the war. And when we say the word artillery, it means guns. So even back in the Revolutionary War, Colonel Phillips said, where a goat can go, a man can go. Where a man can go, he can drag a gun. So when you look at all these cannons and guns, think about men pulling them into position and then firing them. This is what won the war, as Mr. Fuller says at the bottom. Artillery conquers and infantry occupies. So here actually is a picture of Taylor's Battery at Fort Donelson, the battle at Fort Donelson. And what we mean by artillery is a long line of those cannons. I also just want to say that if you're going to get confused a little about what's a regiment, what's a division, what's a battery, the battery is the smallest number. A bunch of batteries makes up a regiment of approximately 200 men. A number of regiment equals a division. In the Union, it was 2,400 men. In the Confederacy, it was 780 men. That's because they had fewer men to distribute. So this is the first one. This is the oldest of the monuments in the cemetery, Bridges Battery. It was put up in 1870. And you see that it's a woman with her hand raised up, surrounded by, look at the picture on the left, cannons. These are cannon barrels opening up to the sky. Some of them are bronze, some iron. This was a battery raised by Captain Lyman Bridges. It was not like, you know, from World War II or Vietnam where we had a draft. It's not like what we do in the Army now where everybody enlists. What happened was, in those days, somebody raised a battery or raised a regiment. They went out, got all the people, and then they became the officer of that regiment. This is the 1st Illinois Light Artillery Regiment. They fought at Chickamauga, Georgia, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Stones River, also called Murfreesboro in Tennessee, and then they were on their way to Atlanta. This is Company B, 1st Regiment, Illinois Light Artillery, or Taylor's Battery. We just saw them fighting in that earlier picture. Taylor's Battery has a howitzer cannon on the top, if you look at the picture on the left. This was a battery of men organized by Ezra Taylor. They fought at Fort Donelson, at Shiloh, at Chattanooga, and on to Atlanta. The interesting thing about this is no men are buried here. These are monuments to the batteries. And at Fort Donelson, their operating officer said, "I die for liberty, boys. You go back and man the gun." That's how important the cannon was, even though he lost his life. There was a battery from the Chicago Board of Trade. A bunch of traders got together and enlisted. They started in August of 1862, and they go through July 1865. They were known as the Flying Battery because they got there so fast. They traveled by rail 1,231 miles, but they marched. That means they pulled the guns for 5,266 miles. And then this one, which is the last one, we went around the monument at Monument Circle. This one is Battery A, Chicago Light Artillery. It is it's the grandest of the monuments, the last one that was put here. It is a full-size cannon done in bronze with a United States flag draped over it. And the battery was run by Captain R.K. Smith. It started out as a militia in 1847, so they were ready to join the Union very quickly in 1861. And this particular battery was taken very quickly down to southern Illinois at Cairo, where Illinois meets the Mississippi River. This battery fired the first shot from a field artillery piece in the Civil War on April 24th, 1861. They also fought at Shiloh, at Chattanooga, and on to Atlanta. Now I'm going to go through the generals of the war, and here is our first set. There's only one general here, and that is Brigadier General John Beveridge, and the other fellow is Philo Judson. But if you think these look so much alike, they are really one stone. I'm just showing you Beveridge is on the eastern side of the stone. Judson is on the western side of the stone. These two guys are related. Philo Judson was John Beveridge's father-in-law. They and then down here at the bottom of the right-hand side is their actual gravestones. So this is the family monument. The interesting things about this is these are the only two guys I'm going to show you who actually fought on the Eastern Front. They enlist very quickly after the Civil War starts, and Judson only serves one term, but Beveridge serves the entire length of the war. He is breveted as a brigadier general when he exits. He comes home to Evanston, Illinois. That's where these guys are from. And he goes on to do a whole lot of other things. He ultimately becomes the 17th governor of the state of Illinois. He was elected lieutenant governor, and then the governor took a leave to go become the senator, and Beveridge moved up. He was not reelected for a second term. Judson also came back to Evanston. Those of you who may be from Evanston would know Judson Street. He's a founder of the city of Evanston. He's a founder of the Northwestern University. He's a founder of the village of Glencoe, as is Mr. Beveridge. They did a lot of stuff. But the other interesting thing about this is look at that monument, both sides. This is not, there's nothing there that says that they were ever in the war. They don't say anything. They don't talk about their ranks, nothing. And they have Art Nouveau art, which was very popular at the turn of the last century, with a very natural look on their family monument. Okay, the next general is Edward Needles Kirk. Like almost every one of these guys I'm going to talk about, he was not born in Illinois. He was born in Ohio in 1828, but he came to Illinois to make his fortune, and he was a lawyer in Sterling, Illinois, married, had 2 kids, doing well. But as soon as the Civil War broke out, he recruited and organized the 34th Illinois Infantry. They served in Kentucky and in Tennessee, and he commanded a brigade of 4 regiments that fought at Shiloh. This is April 1862. He was injured. He was sent home. And then he gets better and gets sent back, which happens to a couple of the guys I'm going to talk about. He's put into what they call the Invalid Corps, and he goes back into battle, and he was wounded again at Stones Creek. He returned to Chicago, and that's where he died. Now, the gravestone itself is very Victorian in its symbolism. It's a draped urn. So the drape is the veil between earth and heaven, and the urn is the symbol of where you would put the body or the ashes. There's not cremation. This is a buried body, and this is his gravestone. But that was the symbol of the sarcophagus kind of thing in the cemetery. Brigadier General John MacArthur was another fellow who fought. First of all, he wasn't born in Chicago. He was born in Scotland in 1826. He came to Chicago when he was 23 years old. He was a soldier in the Scots Highland Guard, but when the Civil War came, he became a colonel in the Union Army. He was wounded at Shiloh and carried from the field, but like the guy we just saw, Brigadier General Kirk, Brigadier General John MacArthur rejoined after he got better and led the troops at Corinth and Vicksburg. And Vicksburg is a very important, as I mentioned earlier, siege that the Union has against a Mississippi city. It took 6 weeks for General Grant and his army to get the Confederates to surrender, but they did surrender on July 4th, 1863. It was an absolute primal victory because it opened up the South to Grant and Sherman to their drive to the sea. It was enough of a victory for the Union that the state of Mississippi did not celebrate the 4th of July for another 50 years. They could only look on it as the day that they lost Vicksburg. General MacArthur commanded Vicksburg post after the Confederates surrendered. He was rewarded for his war effort. He became postmaster of Chicago, and he was a public works commissioner during the fire of 1871. When he had his funeral, it was a day of bereavement for the city. The next general is Brigadier General Benjamin Sweet, again, not born in Chicago, born in New York in 1832, comes to the Midwest in 1848, and really he makes his fortune in Wisconsin. He was a lawyer, he was a state senator, but as soon as the war comes out, he gets into the war and he fights at Perryville, Kentucky. That battle happened to be a draw. Nobody won. It was just, they fought. But Sweet at the time was shot in his right arm and paralyzed. Again, he goes back into the Army, he goes into the Invalid Corps, and he was given the job of overseeing fort construction in Tennessee. But in 1864, he's appointed commander of Camp Douglas. Now, what's Camp Douglas? I'll talk a little bit more about it, but just simply, Camp Douglas is where the Union holds prisoners of war, Confederates. Benjamin Sweet was a strict disciplinarian. Following War Department policies, he increased punishments, he cut rations, men hated him. In the fall of 1864, he discovered a plot by Southern spies to liberate prisoners and burn Chicago down. Whether there actually was a plot is somewhat murky, but at the time they believed Benjamin Sweet, and he was breveted to Brigadier General. Notice that in this monument, he is not buried here. This is a monument to his from his daughter. It doesn't say breveted general, it just says general. Depends on how you feel about that. All right, let's talk about Camp Douglas. Camp Douglas actually opened in 1861. It was a training camp for the Union Army until very quickly in 1863, it becomes a POW camp. The land was donated by Senator Stephen A. Douglas. That's why they call it Camp Douglas. And the original design for the place was intended to hold 8,000 men. By the time this is all over, it's holding 12,000 men. And of course, that means it is violently crowded. It had a very high mortality rate. 6,000 people died here. Why did they die? Well, first of all, you have to understand they all came in here as wounded, most of them came in as wounded soldiers. So a lot of them died from their wounds. But a lot of them also died from starvation because the rations were very limited. Others died from injury and illness because the place was very poorly drained. They had open sewers. And a lot of Confederates died because they had inadequate clothing for Chicago winters. The picture over here on the right-hand side is Confederate soldiers who were at Camp Douglas. I just want to point out that Confederates who died here are buried at Oakwood Cemetery. They weren't allowed in at Rosehill, remember. This is a picture of Camp Douglas. And one of the things that I do have to say is, yes, there was high mortality here, but Chicago was very unhealthy to everybody. We had the highest death rate in the nation at that point, partially because if you look out the back of this picture, you see the lake. And we were drinking water from the lake that had all the gunk and the gook that was thrown in from all the factories and our waste disposal. And we threw it in the Chicago River, which went into the lake, which went right into the drinking water. So it wasn't just the soldiers who were dying. Everybody was dying in Chicago. The other thing about this is that there's a very famous, or my husband told me to say infamous, prisoner of war camp that the Confederates ran, which was called Andersonville. And sometimes Camp Douglas is called the Northern Andersonville. Was it the same? Not really. If you notice here, there are barracks. Andersonville, they said, well, it's in the South, so they didn't have to build a building. People could just sleep out on the ground. They did have rations. At Andersonville, they really did not have any food because by that time, not only the prisoners of war, but the soldiers were starving. And so Camp Douglas was not as bad. We had medical facilities. They were inadequate, but we had some. And so Andersonville is not exactly a parallel. Camp Douglas was a little better than that. Now, the next guy is not a general, but he's certainly a hero. And again, this is not a gravestone. This is a monument. It's an obelisk to Colonel John Bross. Again, not born in Chicago, came to Chicago. He was born in Pennsylvania. Came to Chicago in 1848. He was a lawyer, and he raised a company of Illinois volunteers with the 88th Illinois Regiment. They fought at the Battle of Perryville. They fought at the Battle of Stones River. They fought at Chickamauga. But in 1863, something drastically happens. The Union Army is getting all its men from draft, and a lot of people don't want to go in the draft. They're hiding from it. They're trying to avoid it. And finally, the brass of the Union Army decides that all of these runaway slaves that they have been using just as menial workers in the forts can indeed join the Union Army. So at that point, if you wanted to go into the Union Army as a former slave, as a black man, you had to find a white commander who's going to raise a regiment or a battery. You might remember a movie with Matthew Broderick where he was the white guy and he raises the regiment with Denzel Washington and Samuel Jackson. This is essentially the same story, but it's done by Colonel John Bross from Chicago, and it's done to create the 29th Infantry Regular U.S. Colored Troops. These guys are taken over in July 1864 to Petersburg, Virginia, where they're going to fight the Battle of Petersburg or the Battle of the Crater. And what that means is the Union had this plan where they were going to come right up against a big ridge where the Confederates were, and they were going to blow open a crater or a gap to allow the troops to come in and catch the Confederates off guard, and it was going to be a wonderful victory. Well, none of it happened, except the blowing up to make the crater. It was supposed to have been done, and within an hour, all the troops were going to get in there and surprise the Confederates. But instead, they blew up the crater, and then they took their dear sweet time about it. And it took a whole hour before they even began to send in troops. By that time, the Confederates had reorganized. They got their guns ready. And so they sent the colored troops in first, and they hit a wall of artillery and musket fire with horrendous casualties. Colonel Bross was struck in the head and died instantly. The attack was futile. The Union troops had to withdraw. And of the 400 men in the 29th Infantry, only 128 made it back. The siege continued, get this, for another 8 months. And there never was a surrender until Lee surrendered and the war was ended. So the monument is to Colonel Bross for his efforts, but he is buried in the crater. Now, what about these U.S. colored troops? As I said, they entered the Union Army after 1863. At that point in time, that stops any exchange of prisoners because the Confederate Army will not recognize a slave as a soldier. And so from here on, we have no prisoner exchanges. Now, blacks were allowed to join the regiment if they had white officers. Okay. They were paid but they were paid less than whites. Whites were paid $13 a month with a clothing allowance of $3.50. Blacks were paid $10 a month with a clothing allowance of $3. They're not wearing any different clothes. They're not fighting in any different way, but they're earning less and getting less for their clothing allowance. But even more important was they were not getting an enlistment bonus. And for white soldiers, that was close to $300. Okay, the main politician there are a lot of politicians buried in Rosehill. I don't mean to imply that this is the only guy, but the main politician here is Mayor John Wentworth. Long John Wentworth was called Long John because he was 6.5 feet tall and he weighed 300 pounds. Rosehill Cemetery is theoretically the highest point in Cook County with the exception of Blue Island. Long John Wentworth is on top of the highest point in Rosehill Cemetery, and this is the tallest monument in the cemetery. It's 72 foot tall, just like him. Born in New Hampshire, no surprise, arrives in Chicago in 1836, starts out as a newspaper editor, but becomes a politician. And he was a politician who had a very, very common touch. When the Prince of Wales shows up, it's a long story that he says, boys, meet the prince. Prince, meet the boys. And that's the way he was. He was a very common kind of fellow. He was also very good friends with Abraham Lincoln, to the point that when Lincoln died, Mayor Wentworth was a pallbearer for the body. But because Lincoln's friends in Chicago who were running the city did not exactly get along with Mayor Wentworth stayed in Chicago, didn't have much to do with the running of the Civil War effort. And as you see, he was the mayor of Chicago twice in 1857 and 60, and then he goes to Congress. Now, there are a lot of newspaper men. And the first one that we're going to talk to is a guy by the name of Wilbur Story. And he is the guy who's going to buy the Chicago Times in 1861. If you're thinking the Sun Times, the Chicago Times and the Chicago Sun, way later than this, are going to merge to make Chicago Sun Times. Anyway, born in Vermont, Mr. Story comes to Chicago via New York City, Mishawaka, Indiana, and Detroit, where he established the Detroit Free Press. His theory of journalism was, it's a newspaper's duty to print the news and raise hell. Gives you some idea of what his paper looked like. He buys the Chicago Times from Cyrus McCormick in 1861. He supported Lincoln originally when Lincoln was trying to restore the Union, but as soon as the Emancipation Proclamation shows up, he gives up on Lincoln. He just can't deal with it, and he becomes what we call a copperhead, which is a northern person who is supporting the southern states. He was very sympathetic to the Confederacy, and he wasn't beyond running fabricated stories. He told his reporters, telegraph me all the news. And when there's no news, send the rumors. That's what he did. William Bross is another, William Bross is another man who was one of the founders of the Chicago Tribune. He was a very early supporter of the Republican Party. His paper endorsed John Fremont, who was nominee for president in 1856. He was a very big player in the move to get Lincoln nominated in 1860, and he served as Illinois lieutenant governor from 1865 to 69. Sabina Eastman also came from the East, born in Amherst, Massachusetts. When he was 18 years old, he went to Vermont and he was running a newspaper called the Free Press. But in 1837, in just a little bit south of St. Louis, Elijah Lovejoy was murdered by a pro-slavery mob in Alton, Illinois. And Eastman decided he had to come to the Midwest to devote his life to human freedom. His paper, The Western Citizen, became the largest circulation of any paper in the West, and he backed Lincoln. He was a big friend of Lincoln, and he spent his war years serving as the U.S. consulate in Bristol, England. Now, two things. First is, if you look on the right side picture, you'll see all these smaller gravestones. Those were the original gravestones, but they've eroded. And so this newer granite stone was recently put up by the family. The other thing about Eastman is that he is the first person to write about what we know as the Underground Railroad, as if it were a railroad rather than a series of stops. The Underground Railroad was a network of stops run by abolitionists. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act prevented slaves from escaping to the North to be free. They could be picked up anytime in the North. So most of the slaves were not coming to the North. They were coming to harbors like Chicago or Detroit, where they could get on a boat and go to Canada, where they would be free. Aiding slaves was illegal, but Eastman did it anyway. Just real quick, these are pictures from the era. Up in the right, those are slave hunters. In the middle, that's a watercolor of one of the best known conductors on the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, and the other is just a runaway slave. Now, George Bangs also had a paper, and if you're from the western suburbs, you know the Aurora Beacon is still in business today. He was born in Ohio. He came to Chicago in 1850, tried to get a job in Chicago, but couldn't, so he went out to Aurora and he started the Aurora Beacon. His paper endorsed Lincoln in 1860, and he becomes the postmaster of Aurora in 1861. But most importantly, in 1864, he's appointed the assistant superintendent of the railway mail service. Okay, look at this, this grave. This is really something. On your left, you see this is a tree of life that is broken short, cut short. And that's because Mr. Bangs died at age 51. And yet, on the tree of life on the right-hand side, you see ivy growing and you see a bird. Symbols of life after death. And down at the bottom, again over on the left or in the middle, you see the railway mail car that goes into a tunnel without exit. This means death. So we're honoring George Bangs. And let me just say that the railway mail car was a fantastic invention in that the Union had the railroads. They could keep in touch with their troops. Mail went back and forth. That's where we get all these letters that we use for historical searches, or if you saw that Ken Burns thing where they read out loud, "Dear wife, dear mom, I'm on the verge of whatever." That all came through the mail. And the mail was sorted on the mail cars, and then they'd hang it up they'd wrap it up in a cloth bag, and as they passed a stop, they would throw the mail out and pick up another mail bag that would be hanging on a hook. It was a wonderful innovation for the North, and people say it helped keep the morale up to win the war. In the cemetery, we have 2 medals of honor, one for a breveted Brigadier General, Mr. Sperling, but I'd rather talk about the one for William G. Stevens, because he was a private, one of 6 artillerymen who pulled a cannon up at the Battle of Vicksburg. So what is a Medal of Honor? Well, it was an honor that the United States gives to a service person for individual valor. The proposal came in 1861. By 1862, they were giving them out in the Army and the Navy. By 1863, they made it a permanent thing. And by the end of the war, they gave out 1,522 of them. Overall, in our entire history, from the Civil War through all the wars after, the Spanish-American War, the World War I, World War II, we have given out 3,475. In other words, more than half of the medals of honor were given out during the Civil War. Some people would say they were given out like Oreo cookies. And in fact, after World War I, they were trying to rescind some of them because they thought they had been given out too easily. But still, if you win a Medal of Honor, that's quite an honor. Okay, this is the battle monument from the Battle of Chickamauga in Georgia. A boulder, the one you see in front of you, was brought over to Chicago because the man who led the troops, Union troops in Chickamauga, was George Henry Thomas. You see his name in the right-hand picture, and it was carved into this boulder. Chattanooga was a day that the Union didn't get routed, it only got defeated. I should explain that in a lot of the first 2 years of the war, the Union never was winning. The Union was always on the run. And George Henry Thomas was the general who held the field so that it was not considered a defeat. It was not a rout. They just kind of ended it. He is considered actually one of the 3 top Union generals behind Grant and Sherman. He fought later at Chattanooga, at Nashville, and Atlanta. This Rock of Chickamauga was dedicated in 1894 and rededicated in 1994. And the people who are dedicating it are the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. Those were the Union veterans, and their post, it's like an American Legion post for veterans. Their post is named after George H. Thomas. Okay, I don't have much time left. I've just got 2 pictures. This is Leonard Volk. He is the sculptor that did that monuments that we saw at the beginning. And he has done a number of others that are in the cemetery that I didn't point out. But he's one of the more famous architects of the time. Among other things, he did the bust of Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas that are in the State House. He did the monument over Douglas's tomb at 35th and Lakeshore Drive. He did the mask and hands of Lincoln, which you might have seen at the Chicago History Museum. And he was pretty lucky because he was married to Emily Barlow, the lady whose picture is under his elbow in the left-hand picture, who was a cousin of Stephen Douglas, which is why we think he got a lot of the jobs. Anyway, one of the most important things he did was a marble bust of Henry Clay when he went on to St. Louis. And theoretically, it's the first piece of marble sculpted west of the Mississippi. So this is the end of our tour. Thank you for visiting with me. Just remember, Rosehill took the first soldiers who died in the Civil War and is home to many who came home and then lived lives that influenced Chicago. The Civil War touched many Chicagoans and affected the war, and I hope you enjoy this. And I hope you'll go out, and hopefully by next spring we'll be able to have actual walking tours. And we do tours, that we have 5 tours, 1 of Rosehill, 1 of Oakwoods, and 3 at Graceland. So thank you. Hi, Carolyn. Do we have questions?
Hi, Ellen. Thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. If anyone has any questions, please submit them through the Q&A feature below. Give people a few minutes to type in there.
I guess everybody's just stunned.
A lot of people are saying thank you in the it was an excellent presentation.
Okay, let me add a couple of things. If you are really interested in the Civil War and that kind of stuff, you can go out to Rosehill right now. It's not open for tours. Sadly to say, they are too busy out there because they've got COVID deaths, if that isn't horrible. But as an individual, if you are interested, you can just walk around. These pictures were taken in September. I'm sure it would be gorgeous in the last week of October or early November.
We have a few questions.
Okay.
Someone wanted to know, where is Rosehill Cemetery?
Oh, okay. Well, again, it's on Ravenswood, which is the street that runs right next to the Metra tracks in Chicago. It's on the north side at Peterson and Western. But if you want to get into it, you got to go to the Ravenswood side right off of Peterson, right immediately south of Peterson, and you can drive into that gate that I showed you. And there's a parking lot. There's no problem in going in. I mean, after 4 o'clock, they close the gates. But if you want to go during the day, it is open.
Okay. And someone wanted to know, when visiting the cemetery, do they provide a map of the sites you mentioned?
Some of it. The cemetery has maps, and what you do, it's a dignity cemetery. It's a privately owned cemetery. But you go into the main house, which is when you go in the main gate. If you didn't go up the path that we took to look at the first monument, you just take a right and park your car and then walk back. The little house that's there is open, and you can talk to these people, and they have maps. Whether they have all the same monuments on it, I can't say that they do, but if you ask them for something specific, they will look it up and put it on a map for you. There are a lot of other famous people here that have nothing to do with the Civil War, so they have maps with that too. Like Julius Rosenwald is buried in Rosehill, and other people like that. So there's lots to see in Rosehill Cemetery.
Someone wanted to know, is the cemetery mostly for soldiers?
No, the majority of the people who are buried there, because they buried all of these people in the 1870s, 80s, but then they've continued to bury people. And so there's lots of other people who are not soldiers. Like I said, Rosenwald is there, and there are others who, A.B. Dick. You folks probably are too young, but if you remember Mimeo Machines, that was from the A.B. Dick Company. He's buried there. There's a lot of people who are buried there who are not soldiers. But the main circle is all those batteries and soldiers, and they are proud to say that they have one veteran of every single war the United States has ever been in.
Okay. A few people wanted to know, in the spirit of Halloween, does the cemetery have any ghost stories?
Not that I know of. The cemetery that has a lot of ghost stories, I think, is more Bohemian National Cemetery. I don't know any ghost stories of this because, I don't think people think that soldiers are ghosts. It doesn't go well. The story of somebody walking in a haunted house is one thing, but there's more respect for the people of what they've done here.
Mm-hmm. And do you visit any Civil War cemeteries outside of Illinois and in the South?
I don't. I'm not particularly a Civil War buff, but I know a lot of people have done. I really would like to get to Gettysburg because they say it's very interesting how the lines move, and they have a wonderful museum. I go to a lot of museums, and I know in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, I saw one that was a museum about the Union Army. I mean, I don't know how many people know about the Civil War, but it's the first time we use ambulances. It's the first time that we really get into, in the United States, using nurses. They did it in the Crimean War in Europe. So there's lots of things about the Civil War that are very interesting. And to be perfectly honest, I couldn't do the whole tour here because we didn't have the time. If you join us for a tour, it's 2 hours, and there's a lot more things to see and people to talk about.
Someone wanted to know, who erected the monuments such as the one to Ross?
I believe it was his family. William Bross, his brother, and the rest of the family put that up for him because he's not buried here.
Why were Confederate soldiers not allowed?
Well, remember, it's a war. It was at Chicago, by and large, was an abolitionist city. They did not want to be mingled with Confederates. They wanted to be honored as they are here. And if you notice, all those gravestones are rounded at the top. If they were Confederate, they would be kind of more pointed like this. Nobody wanted to be with the enemy. It's the same kind of thing. We didn't bury American soldiers in German cemeteries. We buried them with Americans or with the French with whom we fought or something like that. So the Confederate mound at Oakwoods is a very different situation. It's a federal piece of property where these people are buried, but they don't get grave markers. They are just buried in trenches around a big obelisk, which has a monument at the bottom where they're named, because individually they didn't even name them. They were the enemy. Nobody wanted to do anything for them.
And someone wanted to know, was this considered the northern edge of the city when the Civil War occurred?
It's not. No. Rogers Park is in the city by this time. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Actually, there's Edgewater and Rogers Park are the two communities that are further north, and the limit of the city ends up being Howard Street, and Western is a good 2 miles south of there. So there's more of the city going. Whether they were actually annexed by 1861, I'm not exactly sure. I don't want to say it. I think they were, but I'm not sure.
What inspired you to learn about the cemetery?
Well, we had a wonderful docent. I am one of 400 people who do these tours. Not all 400 do Rosehill, but we do basic tours about the history of Chicago, and then we specialize in what we want to do. And sometimes it's your neighborhood or whatever. There was a wonderful docent, unfortunately no longer with us, who was a Civil War nut, and he had helped put this together. And he was a friend, and he was looking for help. And I said, sure, why not? But I do have to say, I mean, I have a couple of history degrees. I have a master's degree in history, and so I am drawn to the history aspect of it, even though a lot of what I do is for the Architecture Center is a little more architectural. But this is Victorian cemetery architecture, so it all fits.
Someone wanted to know if the people were not buried at the cemetery, do you know why they wanted monuments there?
Because likely their family is there. In the case of Bross, his family was located here. In the case of all those monuments around the Hero Circle, Monument Circle, those people are around. They're buried somewhere else. But this is a monument to their camaraderie. They all fought together, and so they likely, they might even be buried in this cemetery. I don't know. And the Chickamauga is because that is the local here in Chicago Grand Army of the Republic post, and they are honoring the man for whom they are named. So that's why you have these honorary memorial kind of things.
It looks like there are no more questions in our Q&A and in the chat. So, Ellen, we just want to thank you one more time.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. It's a lot of fun to do these. Appreciate it.
And we want to thank the Chicago Architecture Center for having us as well. And I hope that everyone enjoyed and have a great rest of your night. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.